Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. We welcome you to today's webinar, Marine Insurance, Are the Business Models Still Fit for Purpose? Brought to you by Seatrade Maritime News and the Maritime Online Series. I'm Emma Howe, Maritime's Director of Digital and Customer Development. Let me start by thanking our esteemed panel for joining us this morning to cover this topic from a good number of angles. Before I introduce today's moderator, there are a few housekeeping notes to make you aware of. Towards the end of the session today, we'll be diving into questions from the audience, so I'd encourage you all to use the Q&A function on the right-hand side of this broadcast. If you're viewing in full screen mode, you may have to minimise the player to use the Q&A function, but the team are monitoring the questions in the background and we will present as many of the questions to the panel as possible. If you're worried you haven't taken enough notes, don't panic. You will be able to watch today's session again on demand and share with colleagues who couldn't make it to the live broadcast today. To introduce our panel and guide us through the next 60-minute discussion, please welcome your moderator for this session, Managing Director of PB Marine Consulting, Paul Bartlett. Over to you, Paul.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone from around the world. I'm Paul Bartlett, Managing Director of PB Marine Consulting, and over the next 60 minutes, we'll be discussing how rapidly developing digital technologies have the potential to transform maritime safety and support navigators and engineering staff in the momentous challenges they face in operating ships today. It is with mounting dismay that shipping's insurers, both hull and machinery underwriters and the mutual insurance companies that provide third-party cover across the P&I sector, view the increasing frequency and scale of accidents, particularly involving some of the largest vessels in operation today. To put this in context, the biggest container ships now in operation, for example, can carry 5 times more containers than ships in the last generation, built in the second half of the 1990s. As ship size has increased, so too has the severity of incidents. The frequency of underdeck fires on container ships, for example, is a major concern, following a series of fires in some of which, sadly, seafaring souls perished. Yet there are sensor technologies available today that can identify and provide alarms on temperature changes or the presence of smoke or gas. In recent times, rarely a month has gone by without reports of incidents involving large vessels. The grounding of big bulk carriers, for example, gantry cranes taken out by ultra-large container ships, collisions with jetties in ports, and the world's supply chains disrupted by a large container ship obstructing a key trade lane for nearly a week. But there are no drivers for ship owners and operators to invest in the technologies that are available today. Marine insurers use backward-looking models to assess risk, and of course, many of these new technologies have only become available in the last few years. So there are practically no reliable data, and insurers therefore do not offer incentives to pioneering ship owners and operators. Should the marine insurance industry be taking a more proactive stance? Some car insurers, for example, offer discounts to motorists who install telematic systems, black boxes, or webcams. From a legal perspective, a time may well be approaching when not having digital systems supporting navigators and engineers, systems that are available today, already tried and tested, could be viewed as negligent or even reckless. As Emma previously mentioned, we'd love you to take part in the discussion today, and you can submit your questions using the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please type your questions into that area and we will do our very best to weave them into the conversation with our esteemed panel and answer as many as possible. So, without further ado, it's time to meet our panel. We've got a great mix of skill sets here today, but unfortunately it is with great regret that one of our panel members is unable to join us. The global senior partner at INS Group is unable to be with us. He had an accident at the weekend and has severely injured his foot. He is in great pain and despite best efforts cannot attend. We send him our very best wishes for a speedy recovery. So, to start us off today, we have John Dolan, a Master Mariner and Deputy Director of Loss Prevention at the Standard P&I Club. John has broad experience across many of shipping sectors. Following a successful seagoing career, he came ashore to become a ship manager, a safety specialist, a maritime due diligence provider for shipping banks and law firms, and an undertaker of ship arrests on behalf of banks in far-flung parts of the world. Also on the panel today, we have Eero Lehtavara, also a Master Mariner, who is Head of Regulatory Affairs at ABB. He is also Chairman of OneSea, a collaborative industry body which promotes digital and automation technologies that support navigators and engineers in ship operation. We are also joined by David Petrejko, another Master Mariner and Head of Projects at the Nautical Institute. The Nautical Institute was instrumental in drawing up standards in the field of dynamic positioning, a completely new technology several decades ago, which many thought would never work, but which has proved an essential component in the development of many offshore industries, and without which today we would have no internet. New digital technologies will require new skills in the same way as seafarers undertook new training in the early days of dynamic positioning. So we are lucky enough to have a 5-star lineup on the panel today. The format is as follows. First, I'd like to invite each panelist to speak for 4 or 5 minutes on the growing safety challenge from their perspective. How can the industry promote the adoption of new technologies that can make ships safer? Who will pay? Who should pay? What role should the marine insurance industry play as ship safety climbs the agenda? So, John, over to you.
Good morning, Paul. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you. I thought I would approach this, Paul, by giving you some context to the sector that I'm familiar with, the P&I sector. Hull Machinery is a separate entity, and we can talk about that in a general sense, but I thought I'd give you a brief overview first of my own sector at the higher level, which is the international group, then talk a little bit about the individual clubs and how they perform and how they're structured, and then a little about maritime transport as we see it. Very, very high level comment about where we see the concerns are. And finally, then just a little mention as well about the technology to form a basis for the discussion later on. So, talking a little bit about the international group, because this group is mentioned quite frequently in the press these days. The international group structure comprises 13 P&I clubs, and collectively they insure about 90% of the world's ocean-going tonnage. It's an enormous figure. The clubs are individually competitive within that structure, but they share the large losses. That's the key issue. That is the mutuality issue operating, the sharing of the large losses. They also share their respective knowledge and experience and expertise on matters relating to the ship owner's liabilities and their insurance and reinsurance of such liabilities. Collectively, those clubs, they meet the insurance needs of global shipping through pooling and the reinsurance facilities. And that's the key issue with regards to the international group. The group also provides the best available compensation for people, communities, and the environment. Also, finally, they promote the insurance-related interests of shipping companies through a unified and collective voice. So just to summarize in a very, very short three-sentence manner, the international group is a claims pooling and reinsurance structure. It is also a forum for sharing of information and experience and expertise. And it is also a function or a structure that provides representation to governments, legislators, and maritime regulators on matters relating to ship owners' liability. So that is, in a nutshell, what the international group is about. Now, if we just drill down a little into an individual club, I work for the standard P&I club, but what I'm going to say could apply to any of the other clubs. Britannia, UK, Skull, Guard, all 13 have a similar structure. So each group club is an independent, not-for-profit mutual insurance association. Not-for-profit. So very basically, the premiums that the clubs receive and the investment income that they achieve should equal, all else being considered, should equal the claims and clubs management costs. It's a very simple formula, very simple structure. That's why it's non-profit making. Each club provides cover for its ship owner and charter members against third-party liabilities arising from ship operations. Each club is owned by its ship owner and charter members. Its operations and activities are overseen by the board of directors or committee elected by the membership. In other words, it's an organization for the members and by the members. And the day-to-day operations of the clubs are handled by professional managers, either in-house or external, and they are appointed by and report to the club's board and committee. So that's the very, very basic description of how a typical P&I club will function. Not-for-profit organization. Now, just moving on to the marine transport structure, and I'm going to say something very blindingly obvious here, but I think it's worth saying repeatedly, that maritime transport is the lifeblood of the world economy. It plays a critical role in maintaining trade flows and keeping supply chains intact. That function has never been more important than during the COVID-19 pandemic period. Another big challenge that we're facing right now, leading on from that, is that there is a serious shortage of officers forecast currently and in the future. The latest report on that was issued by BIMCO, the Manpower Supply, in 2015, and those were the forecasts for 2020 and 2025. The International Chamber of Shipping told me last week that a new report is due at the end of this month, in the next coming weeks. That should make for very interesting reading, but it will probably describe the manpower constraint that is in shipping today. Therefore, we know that technology will play a major role in shipping and shipping operations in the future. But very briefly, I would just mention this, that the IMRS published a graphic about 2 or 3 years ago, perhaps, describing the movement in technology and technology development from the simple ship, the simple plant, the simple machinery on board a vessel to something a bit more complicated about 20 years ago, where now there were technical challenges which could only be understood with real effort. In other words, the competence and expertise of the senior officers on board was really stretched as they began to understand and grapple with the complexity. But complexity is the issue now, because as systems have evolved, the system on board, the more sophisticated end of the spectrum, cannot be understood by a single individual. It is a collective team effort, which requires training and lifelong learning. That aspect, I think I'd be interested to explore further with David down the line. So technology is going to feature, but the questions from a ship operations, from a ship manager's perspective, from a ship insurer's perspectives are simply, do we trust the technology? Do we trust the designers of the software, that there's no biases in there or surprise emerging behaviors in the technology that will cause us great alarm and accidents further down the line? I'd like to discuss those further in this session with the panelists. But however, we also have to accept that history shows that the successful companies are those that adopt and embrace technology and achieve competitive advantage. So I'm looking forward to a very interesting discussion. Paul.
John, thank you very much for those thought-provoking comments. I think we've taken on board the importance that technology will play in the future, and the fact that it will have an increasing role to play, and the need for an understanding of how seafarers must be equipped to cope with new technologies as they become available. Now, I'd like to turn to Aero, please, who will tell us a little bit more about these technologies and what is available today. And I hope that he'll be able to demonstrate that there is actually, there are technologies available that can cover virtually any risk that you name. So over to Aero.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for the introduction. And also thank you, John. You both already covered almost everything I was about to say. I work for ABB, which is a fairly large company, and just to kind of make a counter comment on John, we are a company that is striving for profit, but and I don't think that there's anything wrong with it. We do. I very often say that we do products that enables our customers to do as well as possible with the technologies available. I'm chairing a quite interesting alliance between companies called the 1C Alliance, where we are looking at what should be changed and how can we get legislation up to date when it comes to intelligent shipping, higher level of automation, even to a certain extent reluctantly using the word autonomous shipping, because that might be one part of it, but that it's very far in the future. In 1C, just to name a few, because we are large companies like Wärtsilä, Kongsberg, Inmarsat, Cargotec, and of course ABB, is one way to say it also is that to be maybe a little bit provocative, which Paul already touched a bit on, is that the technology is all there. I would say that most of the technologies are available already today. One of the big questions is how to get them approved, how to get the legislation up to date, and one big and very important question is always the stick and carrot in getting new technologies to the shipping industry, because for the ship owner it's very easily seen that everything new is just a cost. So there needs to be a proportional feedback on the value of new technologies, and a lot of the technologies that are brought forward are in a sense very simple. And another thing is also that it's very much the current situation that there's a lot of technologies and we are not using the opportunity. We're not making benefit of the technologies, even when sometimes they feel quite obvious. And that is something that needs to change in a very short period of time for us to be more efficient, to be more safe, to avoid collisions, to avoid especially easy things like avoiding collisions in ports and piers and port structures like and cranes. A lot of those could be avoided with the relevant technologies, and that is something that I think we need to try to figure out which way to get into that. Is it by the insurance companies lowering their taking their premiums down if the ship owner has the right equipment, or ports requiring certain level of equipment to make sure that they minimize the risks of collisions and so on. But also going forward, there's a lot of discussion of manpower shortage. There's a lot of discussion about the training of seafarers, and some of them, those discussions I feel are quite unfair to seafarers, and a lot of discussion that I have been following is also that young people feel that the future of shipping is going to be autonomous, and nobody is going to be needed on the bridges or in the engine rooms of ships. I think that within the next 200 years, that's probably very possible, but that in the near future, I think that what we should and what we are at least focusing on at the moment is to provide the best possible tools for the current crews to do their jobs as efficient and as safe as possible. And a big aspect of that is really to start figuring out how to fit in the digital crew member into the crews of today, and how do we ensure that they are compatible into both directions. And maybe I'll give the word to David after me now to tackle these, and then I will be happy to discuss this further. So over to you, back to you, Paul. Thank you.
Eero, thank you very much indeed for outlining those points. I think you've been able to clear up that we've got more technology available than we're adopting. What are the challenges that we face in getting it adopted? And the fact that it could prevent a lot of incidents, particularly in ports with collisions with cranes and piers. Stick or carrot? Well, let's see in the discussion afterwards. But you've also mentioned the manpower challenge and the fact that it sometimes comes out rather unfairly against the seafarer. And I think it's therefore a good time to turn to David to give us his view from the Nautical Institute point of view, and how we can tackle the manpower challenge that has been referred to already. David.
Thanks very much, Paul. I think I'll start by disagreeing with you. It's always a good place to start. A couple things. You said there are no drivers. I think there are some drivers, and there are some companies that are fantastic adopters of new technology. I think you also said that we have technology that can prevent any risk. What we have to keep in mind is that some technologies create risk, and where the human element fits in with that. So where to start? Well, the Nautical Institute, and thanks for introducing the Nautical Institute, Paul, but we are a professional body, which means that our role primarily is to educate our members on an international basis, and educating them about what's happening with new technology is a big part of that. We also represent our members in forum like the IMO and IALA, and so it's very important for us to understand the implications of technology adoption to help implement those on a global basis. So we do have a little bit of experience in this, and you mentioned dynamic positioning. Very interesting case study, dynamic positioning, because dynamic positioning came in maybe 30, 40 years ago, and it was actually the divers who were the most concerned that at that time, you did not need anything more than your average certificate of competency as a watchstander to operate dynamic positioning. And the divers were concerned because, of course, they're tethered to dynamic positioning ships, and a mistake using that system would cost them their lives. So we did work with the industry to come up with a standard that we now accredit and certify against. And the interesting thing is that advanced technology brought in advanced skills. So you didn't de-skill the labor force with this advanced technology. You had to upscale the education and skills for using that technology. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind as we look at new technology, where the new skills are coming from. Because you can have the best technology in the world, but if it's not used correctly, and we've mentioned autonomous ships. Autonomous ships are a reality, but there are people still in the loop, whether they're on board the ships or whether they're in a remote control center. So those skills are important. I think we talk about this all day, but I think a couple of things I'd like to just bring out is a comparison with the aviation industry. Now, I'm definitely not a fan that taking everything from the aviation industry is what maritime needs. It is not. We are a very different industry. But there are a couple things that they do that we should look at. One is design, and they spend years looking at a design with the human element in mind. They take years just doing a checklist. So that kind of attention is something that we don't do so much in the shipping industry, and maybe we should look at that. They use something called human-centered design, which is a continuous process of listening to the users, what's happening with them, and adapting the design. Now, I'm sure that we can talk about this a lot later, but we have some issues with ECDIS, for example. Now, one of the challenges that we have with ECDIS is that we knew there were problems with ECDIS 15 years ago. There were problems with the interface. There were problems with the alarms. There were problems with manual plotting. But in our shipping industry, changing designs, because we have regulation, because we have type approval, it's very difficult to change design. So if we have something that's not working so well, that is regulated, there's a long lead time to change that regulation or change the design standard so that we can learn from our observations. The final thing that I'll talk about is in aviation, they have something called LOSA, Line Operation Safety Assessments. And this is periodically where they have a trained assessor, and they're not just trained in the technology, but they're trained in human behavior. They sit in the cockpit and they watch what's happening. And if they think that they have an observation to improve something, they can say it. Now, that observation might do with competency, so you would train that through training. It may tend to do with procedures, in which case you can alter the procedures, or it may be something to do with the design, in which case you can change the design. We do not have that in shipping. So we have a lot of observations about what technology can and cannot do, but we don't have a systematic way of bringing that into being. And just as my final comment in this opening will be, a couple of years ago, we did a huge study of our membership on their attitude to technology. And quite frankly, I was a little bit cautious that I thought would get the old, oh, it wasn't like that in my day. But we didn't. Nearly 100% of the comments were positive. But a lot of that was about how do we use technology to reduce the administrative burden on board. So why are we still doing paper logs? Why are we still having different formats for reporting around the world? So I think if we really want to help the mariners, one of the ways we can do that is to remove the administrative burden, remove some of the fatigue, and let them focus on what they should be focusing on. So over to you, Paul.
David, that was very interesting. Thank you very much, and thank you for taking issue with the couple of points that I made at the beginning. It's always that's always good. I think a couple of really interesting things that came out there was the significance of looking outside our industry. The comparison with aviation is very interesting, and the idea of a LOSA is that approach is possibly well worth considering in this as the digital age develops. So thanks for these thought-provoking insights. I'm sure that they're going to provide the basis for a really good discussion in a couple of minutes. We're just going to have a short Sea Trade Maritime Middle East preview video and we'll be talking afterwards about these issues. So please don't go away. Thanks. So welcome back to the second part of today's session, in which we'll be discussing some of these issues in respect of digital and sensor-based technologies. I would like to kick things off with a question for John, and that is, how appropriate do you think are the models that insurers generally, whether it be P&I clubs or hull and machinery insurers, these models are backward-looking models. They work on the basis of casualties and incidents that have happened in the last 10, 20 years, and they estimate the risk in the future based on those models. How relevant are those models today, do you think? Do they need to have? Do they need to be reassessed? John, you're on mute.
That happens to me all the time, Paul. I think it's supposed to be a habit from my wife, keeping me quiet. Apologies for that. Paul, your question is a very interesting one and a very topical one. The systems that are employed that I'm aware of amongst my own in my own sector, but I believe the other insurers adopt a similar way, is that the premiums that are set are based upon data, and that is historic data. But clearly, risks are also assessed with a forward perspective too. So it's not just the data. There are many other aspects taken into account. For sure, there are emerging risks in some sectors, and you alluded to them in your opening regarding container vessels and the aggregated risks that are presented from those vessels, particularly at the larger ships as they continue to grow. But I think the models in the round, Paul, are still fit for purpose. They have served the industry very well, and I believe will continue to do so into the future.
Okay. Eero, one for you. This is putting you on the spot a bit, but that's what we're here for. Could technology have prevented the Ever Given from blocking the Suez Canal for 6 days?
That's an impossible question. I haven't really gone through what happened there, but I would say that the technology in general can assist the crews to do decisions based on better information and have a better understanding of the boundaries of the capabilities that are available at any current situation. But I couldn't go and estimate what was the reasons that it happened and so on. But in general, I would say that if you have a better situational awareness and your capabilities, you can make as a seafarer better decisions on whether things are under control or not. I wouldn't go and speculate further than that on that specific issue.
Right. David, one for you. pilots, the role of pilots. A lot of these incidents that we've spoken about today happen in the either approaches to ports or manoeuvring in ports, collisions with piers and cranes, and pilots are on board at that time. So do you think the system of pilots needs to be looked at in terms of technological advance?
That's an interesting one, Paul. Thanks. The pilots might say that there's a large number of people in hospitals that die. So is that the hospital's fault? Pilotage areas are pilotage areas because they're areas of very high risk, and that's why you employ a pilot. Pilots are extremely valuable. Pilots are probably one of the most progressive sectors of our industry to adopt technology. They were very early adopters of things called PPUs, portable pilot units, and their development over the years has been absolutely fantastic. So they are at the cutting edge. I've seen examples of where they've used drones, whether they're exploring remote pilotage to reduce injuries. Interestingly enough, one of the things, with all the technology in the world, we still suffer with bad pilot ladder rigging, which is not a technology issue. So I think there's a lot we can learn from pilots, working with pilots. One of the interesting things about pilots is that they're very keen observers because they work with so many different types of ships and cultures, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that we must remember about pilots is absolutely non-technology. A pilot is a human integrator. I think as we start going into more VTS-assisted remote pilotage issues, we have to remember that having a pilot on board, there are studies that say something like 60 to 70% of communication is body language. So you have a pilot on board who reads the body language of the crew, who are integrated in that team, that navigation team. And they also usually have very good relationships with the VTS and language skills with the local area. So don't think that pilots just do a technical job. They do a really fantastic human job, and your ship handling skills are fantastic.
Okay, thanks, David. Well, we've got a question in from Ravi Dutta, which I'll just read out. If the international group are privileged to be in such an important position with extensive reach and a global footprint to all authorities relating to the shipping industry, why have the responsibilities and accountability of ports and pilots not been revised with the changes of shipping industry in the past years? Why does the ship's crew and the captain, why are they always the fall guys? The ports and pilots must be made accountable for their shortcomings. So there's a bit of an observation there, but it's an interesting issue. David, what would your response be?
That's purely a legal challenge where responsibilities lie. From the Nautical Institute's point of view, we try to focus more on preventing incidents than dealing with incidents after they take place. Yes.
Eero, I know that in Finland, there have been quite a lot of experiments carried out in terms of the autonomous technologies that can support seafarers in near-shore manoeuvring and port manoeuvres. What is your view on the combination of pilots, seafarers, and autonomy in terms of near-shore and port operations?
I think that David touched already on most of it, and we have to remember that the pilot is a specialist of the region, and the pilot is the consultant to tell the ship's master what are the issues and how to work on, and liaise with the local VTS and then port authorities and so on. What the pilot is not, and is not supposed to be, is a ship's handler specialist on every possible type of vessels coming in. I mean, the physical understanding of the ship's capabilities needs to be with the ship master. So it's crucial that they work together. Sadly, that's maybe not always the case, but the technologies available are giving the possibility for a very large variety of possibilities, like everyone, both in the VTS and the pilot and the master and the port authorities, to have exactly the same view and exactly the same amount of information about the situational position of the ship, and those are obviously things that can be explored quite a lot more. But again, we are looking at it from a number of different angles, everything from the approaches, the VTS operations, as well as tug operations and port operations. The question is very often also legal. What is allowed, what is not, and how do we see how information is used. One of the big challenges that we face is still that it is a system of systems. We have the ship as a system, we have the port, the whole logistics chain, but we are not testing them as a system. We are not regarding them as a system per se, and that ends up in us not really taking the full advantage of all the possibilities that we have, and that extends also to the fact that there might be a number of technologies that could be used, but that you're not allowed to use, and at some stage I think that we need to look quite a lot deeper into this in order to improve the operational effectiveness of the whole system. Thanks, Paul.
Well, one of the issues that we mentioned that David particularly highlighted was the question of design, and the fact that a bridge may incorporate a range of different components that were manufactured differently and come from different places. They're all sort of supposed to be integrated, but it's not designed as a bridge system, or at least in many cases it's not designed as a bridge system. He also alluded to the aviation industry and the fact that the aviation cockpit is absolutely it's human-centered design, but it's based on that. Has shipping got a lesson to learn here? I'm wondering whoever would like to answer that.
One of my favorite topics, and getting back to David and John, I think that we need a week at least to go through all of this. As I said, one of my favorite topics, but I absolutely hate the comparison to the aviation industry when we're talking about technology. I also kind of like it in a sense that a few comments, a little bit simplified and provocatively. Again, the aviation industry has two manufacturers of fuselages and two engine makers, roughly. Let's simplify that a bit, and then one international association looking at the standardization and the rules and so on. One of the key things in aviation is that an airplane is a product. There's absolutely almost no variation whatsoever, except maybe the fuselage color, between two airplanes. If you're going into an Airbus 312, it is going to be exactly the same. So the pilot doesn't have to start looking for different kinds of manuals and switches and whatnot. With a very few exceptions of some maybe late model tugs, there are no sister ships per se. Almost every ship is different. They are individual single projects. They might be on a large ship. They might be, even when we're talking about them being copies, carbon copies and sister ships, you might be having more than hundreds of thousands of components that are not the same. So it's a very bad comparison in that sense. But we need to get into more of a system. Whether it would be nice already to agree that on the bridge that we would have one switch that would take care of the illumination of all of the components that you have on board, instead of having 50 different types and all of that. So there's still long ways to go, and we are not even close to making it the way it should be. But as I said, this is a subject that I would be happy to continue forever. Thanks.
Right. We've had a question come in on cyber. The question says, with so much potential for big data and sensor information living in the cloud, what are the panel's thoughts about ensuring against data breaches, cyber security, and what they might do to premiums and complexities of cover for fleets of the future? John, would you like to have a crack at that?
That is a very difficult question, Paul. Of course, data protection is a big issue. It's, GDPR with all of the personal data protections that are there as well, but that also applies to intellectual property and just the basic data of operating vessels, for example. You certainly don't want that leaking to your competitors. So it's a big area, the whole area of security around data. Clearly, the progressive ship owners and managers are heading towards data-heavy applications. They are fully believers in the we know what we can measure, and therefore data and the challenge of acquisition of data is what keeps these guys awake at night now, to get the very best operating performance out of their vessels and out of their assets. But the security side, well, it is a big issue, Paul, and there's no doubt that the industry is awake now very clearly to what goes wrong when security is breached. Protecting that data is a big concern. Ultimately, would that feed into insurance premium? I think you'd need a more specialist opinion on that. I don't see it happening in the short term. Longer term, as the benefits are more clear from the performances of the vessels, particularly in safety, then it might be an influencer. In fact, it probably will be an influencer, but when and where and to what degree is, from my side, unknown at the moment.
Right. David, I'd like to come back to the human side of things. The Nautical Institute was a pioneer, as I said, in dynamic positioning in the early days, and now provides the world standard for dynamic positioning. So it's got a track record. What steps, what initiatives are there underway for the training of tomorrow's seafarers who will actually need to be digitally aware and capable? Are you aware of academic institutions that are offering courses in digital systems? Are they part of courses already today?
Yeah, good question, Paul. Undoubtedly, seafarers will have to be more data and information savvy. And I think there is a growing trend to have mariners with a college education or university education, at least to a first degree, because it's the skills in mathematics, it's the skills in problem solving that some of that higher education brings out. You mentioned university courses. It's interesting. Just recently, there's been some work being done on something called Maritime Informatics. And if you Google it, maritimeinformatics.org, I think is the website. And that is a specialist science that's developing to deal with the communication of data, not just throughout maritime, but also throughout the entire logistics chain. So yes, these are skills that are taking place. Just on another note, you talk about big data. There's a lot of talk about big data. And one of my favorite quotes, one of our members, Nippon Anon, uses is algorithmic injustice. And this is where you can take big data and ask it to provide you with conclusions based on the big data. Now, there are benefits that can come from that, but you can't forget the human side of things. So regardless of what big data tells you, you do need to just look a little bit further to see if there are human elements that are influencing that, so that you don't fall into the trap of algorithmic injustice.
John, do you think that that is something, insurers need to think about, algorithmic injustice, in the sense that they are using, well, it may not be big data, but it's certainly a lot of data on which to assess risks for the future?
I think it is an ambition. Certainly within our own club, there is a great deal more emphasis and investment being put into systems now to capture as much data as possible. And that's a journey that's only just beginning. 5-10 years from now, there'll be a far greater data set in which to draw conclusions from. But for sure, it is an ambition of the larger insurers, probably all insurers, to develop further their systems to capture information and data. But as for the injustice part, well, yes, there's inevitably going to be a bias when judgments are being made on data. The data doesn't lie; it's our own interpretations. If there are mistakes made, it's the interpretation of that is there. So that there has to be caution, and I quite agree with David's comment there about the dangers of it.
Right, thanks. We've got a question come in which actually is rather pertinent, because we've got 3 master mariners on the panel. Now the question is, does the bridge team need to be changed? In other words, this questioner is asking whether we need a replacement for the radio officer, who is now no longer required. We need a technology specialist, someone who understands systems and can be an integral part of the bridge team. So which master mariner would like to answer that first?
From my side, Paul, I'll just be comment there. I think the bridge team is changing and has changed quite considerably. And I think part of that bridge team will be technology in the future. I can see this, the role for sensors. I'm thinking now about David's comment about the pilot being an integrator. That's a great expression, David. But I think the process is already underway. I would hope that from an insurer's perspective, some of the actions that we're having to underwrite, which are entirely preventable, could be solved with more simple technologies. I'm thinking now about the Milano Bridge, the container vessel that arrived in port in Korea and knocked over gantry cranes costing $50 million. I think those kind of accidents are avoidable, and the changes that are taking place now in bridges with the adoption of greater technologies will help to solve that. But as for the skill sets that you just described, I think technology will feature. I do think the crews of the future will be, and I think I took this quote from one of David's publications, that the crew members of the future will be thinking, assessing, deciding, planning much more than just the simple doing that has perhaps been the model in the past. So things are changing, Paul, and it's a journey that will probably continue. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Eero, any comments on that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, Paul. You talk about a bridge team, but there's a lot of things that happen on the bridge. not just navigation. And this is a concern that we have, is the focus on navigation, because of course, in addition to the navigation systems on the bridge, you have all the fire and smoke detectors coming in, you have cargo monitoring coming in, you have CCTV for security systems coming in. All of those require some sort of monitoring. And it's interesting, I think it was this week or maybe last week, Chirp Maritime, which is the reporting scheme, came out with a really interesting video where they have a neurologist saying that the human brain can only deal with 3 or 4 issues at one time. And the purpose of the video was that a mobile phone for personal use on the bridge, if it's there, it can be very distracting. But if you think of all the other possible distractions we have, I think, if we're going to start looking at technology supporting the people on the bridge, mariners can be very good navigators. But we really should look at reducing the distractions, reducing the fatigue, and using some of that technology to outsource some of those issues so that mariners can be better focused on the key risks that they are there to avoid or manage.
Right. Eero, in terms of the experiments that you've been carrying out in and around Finland in the archipelago and in the ports, what's your view on this question?
Absolutely. I think that the bridge crew is going to be there. And then I think that we shouldn't be afraid of technologies, and then we should maybe demystify the discussion a little bit. We have had the introduction of autopilots, radars, ECDIS, and whatnot on the bridges already for a long time. This is just, in a way, a continuation on that. However, I think that exactly as David said, that what is necessary for the safety of the ship, it's definitely not noon reports or other stuff. And also to keep the people on the bridge where nothing is happening anywhere in the vicinity, and then you're having 1,000 miles to the next ship. That's where you need to use technology in order to have the crew to be able to rest and to focus. The noon reporting is a stupid thing because all the technology is already there. You could do that even live, continuous, digitally at the moment, without the crew having to really to focus on that. To use the crew currently in order to extract information manually from the systems on board, transfer them manually to another set of systems and send them further, is just a waste of time.
Right. Well, it's getting. I'm conscious of the time. We've got just a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to wrap that up now. If we haven't got round to answering your questions from the audience, I'm sorry about that, but we are running out of time. I'll soon be passing back to Emma Howell to wrap up the forum today. First, though, I would like to thank our distinguished panel members for taking part, and I would also like to thank the many people from all over the world who have joined to watch today's session. I hope to see you again in person soon. Thanks. Emma.
Thank you very much, Paul, for moderating another very interesting session. Don't forget, the session will be available on demand in the Maritime Online Series platform. So if you found it valuable, please do invite colleagues who couldn't make it to the live session to join in. Please do check out the rest of the live and on-demand content on offer within the platform. Our next and last live session for the Maritime Online Series takes place tomorrow with our Sea Trade Ship Tech Virtual is Ship Finance Transforming Faster Than Shipping webinar. Also, a quick reminder to let you know, call for entries for both the Sea Trade Awards and Sea Trade Maritime Awards Middle East, Indian Subcontinent and Africa, both now in association with Lloyd's List, are still open, but deadlines have now approached, so please do make sure you enter, and more information can be found on the websites. Thank you to everyone who's been watching and taking part, and until next time, thank you and goodbye.